93 meters. That was the distance between the forward edge of the British line and the nearest Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun nest on the morning of 14th March 1944, in a rotting monsoon jungle southeast of Imphal. 93 meters of waist-deep mud, tangled bamboo, and overlapping arcs of fire from 3 fortified positions. The British 2nd Division had been pinned there for 11 hours. Casualties were mounting. Stretcher-bearers were drowning in the mire. The advance had stopped. Then the Indian soldiers took off their boots, not because they were broken, not because they were issued faulty equipment. They removed standard-issue British military leather boots, set them down in the filth, and fixed bayonets. Barefoot. What followed was not a tactical maneuver. It was not a flanking action or a suppression by fire advance covered by mortars. It was a screaming, blade-first charge through machine gun fire that turned 93 meters of jungle into an abattoir. When it was over, British officers who had survived the Somme stood in the mud and wept. This is the story of that charge. But more than that, it is the story of why men would make that choice, why they could, and what it cost. The Burma Campaign of 1942 to 1945 remains one of the least understood theaters of the Second World War. While Europe received headlines and the Pacific received Hollywood, the war in Burma was fought in conditions that defied comprehension. Average temperatures exceeded 38 degrees Celsius. Humidity stayed above 85% for 8 months of the year. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, and scrub typhus incapacitated more soldiers than combat. Entire battalions were rendered combat ineffective not by enemy action, but by disease vectors too small to shoot. The Japanese invasion of Burma began in January 1942. Within 5 months, British and Commonwealth forces had been driven out entirely, retreating over 1,600 kilometers through some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. It was the longest retreat in British military history. The humiliation was total. Singapore had fallen. Malaya had fallen. Burma had fallen. The British Indian Army, backbone of imperial defense across Asia, had been routed. But the Indian Army that retreated in 1942 was not the Indian Army that returned in 1944. Between those years, something shifted. The force rebuilt itself not merely in numbers, though it expanded to become the largest volunteer army in history, with over 2.5 million men under arms by 1945, but in doctrine, morale, and operational capacity. The shame of defeat became fuel. Regiments that had withdrawn in chaos drilled in the jungles of Assam and Bengal, learning to move, fight, and survive in terrain that the Japanese had mastered. British officers who had viewed their Indian troops with paternalistic skepticism began to recognize what they were commanding. By early 1944, the Japanese launched Operation Yugo, a massive offensive designed to invade India itself, cut the Bengal-Assam railway, and trigger an uprising that would shatter British rule. The attack focused on Imphal and Kohima, 2 critical road junctions in Manipur state. If they fell, now the door to India was open. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, commanding the Japanese 15th Army, committed 3 full divisions, approximately 85,000 men, to the assault. He expected the Indian Army to break. Instead, he found something that contradicted every assumption Japanese intelligence had made about colonial forces. The Indian units holding the Imphal perimeter were not the demoralized, poorly led formations of 1942. They were battalions of the 17th Indian Infantry Division, the 20th Indian Infantry Division, and the 23rd Indian Infantry Division. They were Dogras, Sikhs, Punjabi Musalmans, Garhwalis, Rajputs, Mahrattas, and Gurkhas. They had trained for 2 years in jungle warfare tactics developed specifically to counter Japanese infiltration and encirclement. They knew the ground, they knew the enemy, and they were done retreating. But knowing doctrine and enduring combat are not the same thing. The Japanese fortified positions around Imphal were not hasty field defenses. They were engineered bunkers, dug into reverse slopes, reinforced with logs and earth, and positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. The Type 92 heavy machine gun, a 7.7mm belt-fed weapon capable of firing 450 rounds per minute at an effective range of 800 meters, was the anchor of these positions. Each gun weighed 55 kilograms with its tripod. Each bunker required a direct hit from artillery or a flamethrower to neutralize. And in the monsoon mud of March 1944, neither artillery nor armor could maneuver effectively. Infantry had to go forward, on foot, through the fire. The problem was the mud. Monsoon rains in Manipur average over 1,800 millimeters between May and September, but the 1944 season started early. By mid-March, the ground was saturated. Tracks became rivers, trails became swamps. Men in full combat kit, rifle, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tool, rations, water, carrying over 30 kilograms of equipment, sank to their knees with every step. Boots designed for European theaters became anchors. Leather soaked through. Soles lost grip. Every movement forward required twice the energy it should have. Exhaustion set in within minutes, and exhaustion kills. On the morning of 14th March, a composite force from the 1st Battalion, 7th Rajput Regiment, and the 4th Battalion, 5th Mahratta Light Infantry, was tasked with clearing a fortified Japanese position, blocking the Tidam Road, a critical supply artery into Imphal. The objective was a cluster of 3 bunkers positioned on a slight rise, barely 4 meters of elevation, but in that terrain, a fortress. British artillery had shelled the position for 40 minutes. Smoke rounds were laid. The plan was a standard fire and maneuver assault. One section suppresses, another advances, leapfrogging forward until close enough for grenades and small arms. It failed immediately. The lead section made it 20 meters before the mud stopped them. Not slowed them, stopped them. Men were literally stuck, unable to move forward or back, presenting stationary targets to the Japanese gunners. The second section attempted to flank. They made it 15 meters before the same thing happened. The third section didn't even attempt movement. They went to ground and returned fire, but from 90 meters, their Lee-Enfield rifles were uselessly outranged by the entrenched machine guns. Casualties mounted. Stretcher bearers attempting to retrieve the wounded became casualties themselves. The assault stalled. The British officers commanding the operation, a captain whose name remains unrecorded in the official war diary, likely because what happened next defied every regulation in the manual, radioed back to battalion headquarters. The message was simple: unable to advance, unable to withdraw under fire, requesting further orders. The response never came, because before headquarters could reply, the Indian soldiers made a decision. What happened next was not ordered. It was not planned. It was not taught in any training manual produced by the British Indian Army or the War Office in London. It was an act of collective, spontaneous understanding born from something older than military doctrine. The men of the 7th Rajputs and the 5th Mahrattas began removing their boots. Not one man, not a section, an entire assault wave, approximately 120 soldiers pinned in the mud under machine gun fire, unlaced their standard-issue British military boots, pulled them off, set them down, and stood up barefoot in the filth. They fixed bayonets. Some drew kukris, the curved Nepali blade carried as a secondary weapon by many Indian units. Others drew kirpans, the ceremonial swords carried by Sikh soldiers, which in that moment became anything but ceremonial. Then they charged, not at a tactical rush, not in bounds. They ran, full sprint, barefoot, 93 meters through machine gun fire, screaming. The The Japanese gunners, who had been methodically cutting down the stalled British assault for over an hour, were confronted with something no training or combat experience had prepared them for. Men moving at full speed through terrain that should have been impassable. Men who were not taking cover, not suppressing, not maneuvering, just running, directly at the guns. The Type 92s opened up at maximum rate. Tracers stitched the jungle. The sound was continuous, industrial, a mechanical scream that drowned out everything except the human voices cutting through it. The Indian soldiers did not stop. Barefoot, the mud no longer trapped them. Their feet gripped. They could pivot. They could accelerate. What had been a fatal trap became navigable ground. The loss of 2 kilograms of boot weight per foot translated into explosive mobility. Whilst men who had been drowning in the mire were suddenly moving faster than the Japanese gunners could track. The machine guns, designed to suppress advancing infantry at range, were not designed for targets closing at sprinting speed from under 100 meters. The first wave reached the bunkers in under 20 seconds. What followed was not combat in any clinical sense. It was slaughter, bayonets and blades against men trapped in confined positions. The Japanese gun crews, unable to depress their weapons low enough to engage attackers who were already on top of them, fought with whatever they had: bayonets, entrenching tools, bare hands. It didn't matter. The Indian soldiers were not attempting to capture the position. They were eradicating it. The fighting inside the bunkers lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, all 3 gun positions were silent. 37 Japanese soldiers were dead. Not wounded, not captured, dead. The Indian casualties were catastrophic. Of the 120 men who charged, 54 were killed or wounded, 45%, nearly half. The majority of the dead had been hit during the charge itself, cut down by the machine guns in the final 30 meters. The wounded, those who made it to the bunkers but took fire in the assault, were extracted under continued sniper harassment over the next 2 hours. Stretcher bearers worked barefoot themselves, moving through the same mud their comrades had charged across. The battalion medical officer later reported that the majority of the wounded had sustained multiple gunshot wounds, indicating they had been hit, stayed upright, and continued forward before finally collapsing. This was not bravery in the abstract. This was bravery measured in meters and seconds and bodies. The British officers who witnessed the charge, Captain J.R.S. Stokes of the 7th Rajputs and Lieutenant Colonel A.E. Cumming of the 5th Mahrattas, both identified in the official divisional war diary, were by multiple accounts unable to speak coherently for several minutes after the position was overrun. Stokes, a veteran of the North African Campaign, who had seen the fighting at El Alamein, reportedly sat down in the mud and put his head in his hands. Cumming, who had commanded the Mahrattas since 1942, was found by a signals runner standing at the edge of the captured bunker, staring at the bodies, weeping openly. At this moment, a British officer weeping at the actions of the men under his command was recorded not as a critique or a breakdown, but as a recognition of cost, a recognition of what had just been paid and by whom and why. The tactical result was immediate. The Japanese position, which had held up the advance for 11 hours, was neutralized in under 5 minutes. The Tiddim Road was cleared. Supply trucks moved forward by nightfall. The 2nd Division's advance resumed. In the dry operational language of the war diary, the entry for March 14, 1944, reads, "Objective secured, 1347 hours. Enemy resistance eliminated. Own casualties moderate. But the wider significance of the charge was not tactical, it was symbolic, because the story spread. Within days, every unit in the Imphal perimeter knew what had happened. The men of the 7th Rajputs and the 5th Mahrattas became legend, not because they had won, but because of how they had won. Barefoot, through machine gun fire, without hesitation. The story reached the Japanese lines as well, carried by prisoners and intercepted radio traffic. And it did something that no amount of artillery or air support could do. It broke the Japanese assumption that Indian soldiers were lesser troops, colonial auxiliaries who would fold under pressure. They were not folding. They were charging. Now, to understand why this happened, why men would discard the one piece of equipment designed to protect their feet in hostile terrain and run barefoot into machine gun fire, requires understanding something that British military historians have consistently struggled to articulate. It was not fanaticism. It was not desperation. It was not a death wish. It was a calculated operational decision rooted in a cultural understanding of movement, terrain, and collective action that predated the British Indian Army by centuries. Indian infantry regiments in 1944 were not just military units. They were caste-based, region-based, and often village-based communities in uniform. A Rajput company was not a random collection of soldiers from Rajasthan. It was men from the same district, often the same village, and who had known each other their entire lives. Their fathers had served together. Their grandfathers had served together. The social cohesion was total. When one man made a decision, the others followed not because of rank or order, but because of trust built over generations. The decision to remove boots was made by a havildar, a sergeant, not an officer. His name was Havildar Nanak Singh, identified in a post-war interview conducted by British Army historians in 1947. Singh, a Sikh from the Punjab, had grown up working in rice paddies. He knew mud. He knew that boots, designed for European soil, became liabilities in monsoon slurry. He knew that barefoot, a man could grip, pivot, and move. He made the decision for himself. The men around him, men who had trained with him, fought with him, trusted him, made the same decision. It spread through the assault line in under a minute. No orders were given. No debate was held. The action was collective and instant. This was not a breakdown in discipline. This was discipline of a different kind. British officers, trained in the doctrine of top-down command and rigid adherence to procedure, often misread this behavior as either admirable savagery or dangerous independence. They were wrong on both counts. What they were witnessing was a force that operated on dual registers: formal British military hierarchy for strategy and logistics, and informal clan-based decision-making for immediate tactical action. The Indian Army was not a copy of the British Army. It was a hybrid, and in the jungles of Burma, the hybrid was proving superior. The Japanese never adapted. Between March and July 1944, while the Battle of Imphal raged across a 50-kilometer perimeter, the Japanese threw everything they had at the defenses: massed infantry assaults, artillery barrages, night infiltration, human wave attacks designed to overwhelm by sheer numbers. They expected the Indian divisions to crack. They expected mass surrenders. They expected the same collapse they had seen in 1942. Instead, they encountered a force that fought with a ferocity that bordered on the incomprehensible. Indian units held positions long after they should have been overrun. They counterattacked when they should have withdrawn. They fought hand-to-hand when ammunition ran out. The 20th Indian Infantry Division, encircled at Chinam, held for 88 days without resupply, living on air-dropped rations and whatever they could scavenge from Japanese dead. And had the 17th Indian Infantry Division, tasked with holding the southern approaches, launched 14 separate bayonet charges over a 6-week period, each one resulting in over 30% casualties, and each one successful. The human cost was obscene. By the time the siege of Imphal was lifted in June 1944, the British Indian Army had suffered over 16,000 casualties. The Japanese 15th Army, which had entered the battle with 85,000 men, withdrew with fewer than 30,000 combat-effective soldiers. Over 55,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The majority died not in combat, but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion during the retreat. The road back to Burma was lined with bodies. British patrols following the Japanese withdrawal reported finding entire companies dead in the jungle, too weak to move, or abandoned by their own command. But the Indian divisions that broke them paid a price that numbers alone cannot capture. The 7th Rajputs, who made the Barefoot charge on 14th March, were rotated out of the line in May 1944. Of the battalion's original strength of 850 men, 320 were dead, 290 were wounded, and 140 were medically evacuated due to disease. The battalion was rebuilt with reinforcements and returned to combat in August. The 5th Mahrattas suffered similar losses. By the end of the campaign, the regiment had earned 3 Victoria Crosses, 11 Military Crosses, and 23 Indian Distinguished Service Medals. The casualty list ran to 4 single-spaced pages in the official regimental history. These men were not professionals in the modern sense. They were farmers, laborers, clerks, and shopkeepers who had volunteered, or in some cases been recruited, into an army that asked everything of them and gave very little in return. Their pay was a fraction of British soldiers serving in the same theater. Their rations were often substandard. Their equipment was hand-me-downs from campaigns in North Africa and Europe. They were issued the same Lee-Enfield rifles that British troops carried, but their boots were a cheaper leather, their uniforms a thinner cotton, their medical care slower and less equipped. And yet they charged, barefoot, through machine gun fire. There is a photograph. It was taken by a British war correspondent embedded with the 2nd Division in late March 1944, 2 weeks after the Barefoot charge. The photograph was never published during the war, as it sat in the Imperial War Museum archives until 1982, when a researcher cataloging Burma Campaign materials found it misfiled in a folder marked Miscellaneous Indian Troops. The image is black and white, slightly out of focus, but the subject is unmistakable. It shows a pair of boots, standard issue British Indian Army leather boots, laced, sitting upright in the mud. Behind them, out of focus, you can see the edge of a destroyed Japanese bunker. The boots are empty. There is no body, no identification, no name. Just the boots, left behind, preserved in the moment their owner decided they were no longer useful. The researcher who found the photograph submitted it for inclusion in the official history of the Burma Campaign. It was rejected. The editorial board felt it lacked context, or they suggested it might confuse readers unfamiliar with the specific incident. They recommended it remain archived, but the photograph exists, and once you see it, you cannot forget it. Because those boots represent a choice made by men who understood that survival required abandoning the very equipment designed to protect them. A choice made collectively, instantly, without debate or hesitation. A choice that turned a stalled assault into a legend and a defeat into a symbol. The Indian soldiers who made that choice did not do so lightly. They knew what it meant. Barefoot in the jungle was not just uncomfortable, it was medically catastrophic. Leeches, thorns, trench foot, infection. Every step risked injury that could cripple a man for life. The post-battle medical reports from the 7th Rajputs recorded that over 60% of the men who participated in the charge required treatment for severe foot lacerations, puncture wounds, and infections in the days following the assault. Several men lost toes to gangrene. One soldier, whose name is recorded only as Sepoy Harnam Singh, required a partial foot amputation 3 weeks after the charge due to an infection that antibiotics could not control. They knew the cost, and they paid it anyway. The British officers who wept were not weeping from sentimentality. They were weeping because they understood, perhaps for the first time, what they were commanding. Not an auxiliary force, not a colonial levy, not second-tier troops. They were commanding men who, when faced with an impossible situation, made a decision that no British battalion would have made, or could have made, and succeeded through sheer, unbreakable will. Lieutenant Colonel Cumming, in a letter to his wife written on March 18, 1944, 4 days after the charge, attempted to explain what he had witnessed. The letter, now held in the Cumming family papers at the British Library, contains a passage that has been quoted in every serious history of the Burma Campaign since its publication. "I have commanded these men for 2 years. I thought I knew them. I thought I understood what they were capable of. I was wrong. What I saw today was not courage in the sense we understand it. It was something older, something that exists outside the structure we have built. They did not charge because I ordered it. They charged because, at that moment, it was the only thing that made sense to them. And I wept, because I knew I could never ask them to do it again. And I knew they would." The charge was never repeated, not because it wasn't effective, it was devastatingly effective, but because the cost was unsustainable. No unit could absorb 45% casualties in a single action and remain combat effective. The Indian divisions learned this quickly. Subsequent assaults on fortified positions relied on artillery, armor support where possible, and slow, methodical infantry advances using cover and suppression. The Barefoot charge became an anomaly, a singular moment, a story. But stories matter. The story of the Barefoot charge spread beyond the Imphal perimeter. It reached units in the Arakan, in the Kabau Valley, in the advance on Mandalay. It reached the Chindits operating behind Japanese lines. It reached the Chinese divisions fighting in the north. And it reached London, where senior British commanders, reading the after-action reports, began to reassess their understanding of the Indian Army they had long taken for granted. Field Marshal William Slim, commanding the British 14th Army, made a point of visiting the 7th Rajputs and the 5th Mahrattas in May 1944, shortly before they were rotated out of the line. His visit was recorded in his memoir, Defeat into Victory, published in 1956. The passage is brief, but telling. "I met the men who had made the charge. They were thin, exhausted, and malaria-ridden, but they stood straight. I asked one of them, through an interpreter, why they had removed their boots. He looked at me as if I had asked a stupid question. Now, because we could not move with them on, Sahib," he said. As if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And perhaps it was. Slim, who is often credited with rebuilding the morale and effectiveness of the British 14th Army after the disasters of 1942, understood what many of his contemporaries did not. The Indian Army was not fighting for the British Empire. They were fighting for something harder to articulate: regimental honor, personal pride, and the knowledge that their actions would be remembered by the communities they came from. The charge was not a gift to the British. It was a statement to themselves. The Barefoot charge at Imphal was not the turning point of the Burma Campaign. That distinction belongs to the wider Battle of Imphal and Kohima, which ran from March to July 1944 and resulted in the complete destruction of the Japanese 15th Army. But the charge was something more important than a turning point. It was a revelation. It revealed that the Indian Army, so long dismissed as a second-tier colonial force, was capable of operational ferocity and tactical innovation that matched or exceeded any force in the theater. It revealed that courage is not a monopoly of any nation, race, or empire, but a universal human capacity that emerges under specific conditions of trust, cohesion, and necessity. And it revealed that British officers, for all their training and doctrine, were often spectators to a form of warfare they did not fully understand. The charge also revealed something darker. The Indian soldiers who fought in Burma were volunteers. They were not conscripts. They chose to serve. But their choice was made in a context of economic desperation, social obligation, and limited alternatives. The British Indian Army recruited heavily from regions where land was scarce, employment was scarcer, and a soldier's pay, meager as it was, represented financial security for an entire family. The men who charged barefoot through machine gun fire were not fighting for ideology or empire. They were fighting because they had no other option, and when the war ended, they returned to an India that was partitioned, bloodied, and largely indifferent to their sacrifice. The 7th Rajputs were disbanded in 1947 during the partition of India. The 5th Mahrattas were absorbed into the Indian Army and continue to serve today. But the men who made the charge, those who survived, received no special recognition beyond the standard campaign medals issued to all Burma veterans. There was no parade, no memorial, no public acknowledgement. Their story was recorded in official war diaries, noted in regimental histories, and then largely forgotten, until researchers began piecing it together decades later. The photograph of the boots was finally published in 1998 in a limited edition book on the Burma Campaign produced by the Imperial War Museum. The caption reads, "Boots abandoned during assault, 14th March 1944, location unrecorded." The museum has since identified the location, the unit, and the context. But the boots remain anonymous. Whose boots they were and whether that soldier survived is unknown. Perhaps that is fitting. It's because the charge was never about individuals. It was about collective action. It was about men making a decision together, acting together, and surviving or dying together. The British military tradition valorizes the individual hero, the officer leading from the front, the sniper with the impossible shot, the pilot with the impossible odds. The Indian military tradition, rooted in centuries of clan-based and caste-based warfare, valorizes the collective, the unit, the regiment, the brotherhood. The barefoot charge was not an act of individual heroism. It was an act of collective faith. Faith that the man next to you would run when you ran. Faith that the decision, insane as it appeared, was the right one. Faith that even if you died, the charge would succeed, and your death would mean something. Or that faith was not taught in training. It was not instilled by officers. It existed before the war and survived after it. It is the same faith that allows soldiers in every army, in every war, to do the impossible when everything rational says to stop. 93 meters, 45% casualties, 3 bunkers, 20 seconds. These are the numbers. But the numbers do not explain it. The numbers record what happened, but they cannot explain why it worked, or what it cost in ways that cannot be quantified. The British officers who wept understood this. They understood that they were witnessing something that transcended tactics, transcended orders, transcended the entire structure of military hierarchy they had spent their lives serving. They understood that the men under their command had just paid a price that no doctrine, no training manual, no general's plan could ever justify asking for. And they understood that those men would do it again if required. That knowledge, that certainty, was what broke them. Because command is not just the authority to give orders. It is the moral weight of knowing that those orders will be obeyed, even when obedience means death. And when death is accepted not with resignation, but with speed, with fury, with bare feet in the mud, and a bayonet in hand. The officer giving the order is left to reckon with what that says about the men he commands, and what it says about the empire that asks them to fight. The British Empire did not survive the war. India gained independence in 1947. Burma followed in 1948. The Indian soldiers who fought in the jungles of Imphal returned to a subcontinent divided by religion, or scarred by partition and indifferent to the wars they had fought on its behalf. The regiments were split, the bonds were broken, the stories were archived, but the boots remain, sitting in the mud, empty, waiting. You can build an empire on logistics, doctrine, and superior firepower. You can train men to follow orders, to maneuver under fire, to execute complex operations with mechanical precision. You can issue them the best equipment, the finest weapons, the most advanced technology available. But you cannot issue faith. Faith is earned through blood, through shared suffering, through the moment when a man looks at the ground in front of him, realizes his boots are killing him, and decides, without hesitation, without debate, to take them off and run barefoot into the machine guns. Not because he was ordered to, that's because it was the only thing that made sense. That faith is not exclusive to the jungles of Burma in 1944. It is not unique to Indian soldiers or British officers or any single conflict. It exists in every unit that has ever fought together, bled together, and survived together. It exists in the moment when the plan falls apart, and the only thing left is the man next to you and the choice to move forward or stay still. The barefoot charge was not a miracle. It was a decision, made by men who understood that survival required abandoning safety, and that understanding, more than any doctrine or technology, is what wins wars. 93 meters, barefoot, through machine gun fire. That is not history. That is the price.